Abdul Razak Gurnah, the Zanzibar-born British author, got Nobel Literature Prize. He
Mm.
said something which was that whenever in English language you use words which are, say, Sanskrit, Farsi, Arabic, you italicize it. You means he's talking to the British or the colonizers. And this is another form of othering that
Has a different approach to language than what you were describing in English, even though he writes exclusively in English. So his novels, words that kind of evoke these Persianate connections, and
wow.
of course they're not italicized, but they're full of words that are borrowed from these languages. Often they are Swahili words. They're words from the context that he's writing about in Zanzibar and elsewhere in East Africa. They're words that have come to Swahili through Arabic.
So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Middle East Insights, and my name is Dr. Shubda Chaudhary. And today we are going to try something really very new and fascinating. It is like inspiring, challenging, and also very difficult to understand at times. So, what exactly is it? We are going to talk about a book, The Making of Persianate Modernity, Language and Literary History Between Iran and India. And for that, we have Alexander Jabbari, sir, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at University of Minnesota. He is a literary historian working on literature, history, philology on the Middle East and South Asia. His research has been published in Iranian Studies, Journal of Middle East Women's Studies, Journal of Persianate Studies, International Journal of Islam in Asia, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and Middle East, and so many other places. He's also very active on Twitter and Blue Sky. So, the book basically, The Making of Persianate Modernity, it says that from the 9th to the 19th centuries, Persian was a preeminent language of learning far beyond Iran, stretching from the Balkans, and you should know where the Balkans are, to China. In this book, Alexander Jabbari sir explores what became of this vast Persian literary heritage in the 19th and 20th centuries in Iran, South Asia, as nationalism and different kinds of nationalism took over. He shows how Iranians and South Asians drew from their shared past to produce a Persianate modernity and create a modern genre, literary history, drawing from both Persian and Urdu sources, and he also knows Spanish from the age of 15. Jabbari sir reveals the important role that South Asian Muslims played in developing Iranian intellectual and literary trends, highlighting cultural exchange in the region and the agency of Asian modernizers. Sir charts a new way forward for area studies and opens exciting possibilities for thinking about language, literature, how we communicate, and how we see ourselves through that communication. So, thank you so much, sir, for you have a very busy schedule, and in spite of that, you have endowed us with 1 hour. No one is going to ask extra questions and delay it. So I'm very thankful to you for your say pass.
Thank you for your kind invitation. I'm happy to speak with you today.
Thank you, sir. So my first question is, and everyone can ask the question in the chat box. My first question is that one thing which I noticed in your book is that you have included a lot of Gregorian Islamic calendars, different kinds of calendars. And that is one of the problems when we are translating because of the calendar differences.
Mm.
So how did you manage to do that? Like how much time and patience did it require?
Oh, that's not a huge problem, but it's just something we have to deal with when working with sources that are that were written and published in a different context, where the Islamic calendar, for example, or different Islamic calendars, the solar or the lunar
Yeah.
calendars are used. So thankfully today there are nice applications that can instantly convert a date from one calendar to the other. So yeah, I just have a note in the book about that. It's kind of a standard thing.
Okay. The next question is that how did the rise of nationalism in the 19th and 20th century, according to you, did impact Persianate literary and cultural heritage across Middle East and South Asia?
Sure. There's a kind of standard narrative that I was arguing against that takes the rise of nationalism to be the end of this kind of connected sphere. Actually, maybe I should say something about what is the Persian. I don't know how much your audience is familiar with this term specifically, but it's one of these kind of scholarly terms that we've come up with that's not a translation of a Persian word or an Urdu word or an Arabic word or something like that. Um, but a term that we kind of use to describe this geography that you mentioned in your introduction from the Balkans and Southeast Asia under the Ottomans, as far east as parts of China and Siberia, as far south as into the Deccan and southern, getting into southern India and elsewhere. A place that was connected by the use of Persian as a language of learning, as a literary language, as a language of state. So we call that kind of wide geography the Persianate world. And again, the kind of standard narratives that we had for understanding this history is that okay, this somewhere around the ninth century, and then in the following centuries, this kind of takes off. Persian takes off as a literary language, as a language of statecraft, and connects all these places through having a shared language, a shared set of texts that people read and know, and shared set of conventions. And the idea is that, okay, with the rise of nationalism in the 19th, early 20th centuries, that's the end of this interconnected world. And now instead of having this broad kind of Persianate geography, you now have here's India, here's Pakistan, here's Iran, here's Uzbekistan, whatever. And these are separately bounded, independent nation states that no longer have, and of course they use new and different languages. They don't necessarily continue using Persian in an official capacity. And so my argument in the book is that this is a different era or a different phase of the Persianate. It's not the end of the Persianate, for one. That just as we don't think about the Persianate meaning the same thing, being arranged in the same way in the 9th century as we do in the 15th century, we can similarly think of the 19th or 20th century as in some ways, a continuity. Um, and I found in the research that I did for this book that was the case, that people remained engaged with one another, continued using Persian and using the kind of framework, the networks rather, that had been established through Persian before nationalism. They continued using those in the era of nationalism to connect people, to exchange ideas, to build new institutions, states, forms, new approaches to culture, literature, all sorts of things.
So, at a personal level, for example, um, so we know that there is this entire terminology of Orientalism and how the West looks at the Orient. Now, you as a scholar with the so-called Orient lineage were developing in the West. Did you often find it frustrating that the so-called Orientalists had a very jaundiced point of view when it came to looking at languages in the past?
Mm, And there are certainly um, yeah, cliched ways of thinking about this part of the world that develop in the Orientalist tradition of study. Um, I think I came up in the academy was being trained in an era where that had already been subject to a great deal of scrutiny, where Edward Said's
Yep,
Orientalism, for example, was already a canonical text that everybody read, where the critique of Orientalism was already sort of taken for granted. So it was not necessarily the case that my experience studying these things in American universities was totally shaped by at least a sort of the image that we have of the Orientalist scholar with his bigotries and his relationship to power and so on. I think it was already more complicated by the time I entered the academy. Which is not
that's
to say that it's no longer
yeah.
relevant. We still have, this close relationship between power and knowledge that Said, drawing on Foucault, kind of explicates and critiques there. But again, I think it's just not quite so black and white.
Yeah, because we also have our own Occidentalism
Mm,
and the way of looking at, the Western scholars interpreting the Orient and so-called. So it's really complicated. But for our audience, I'm going to make it easier. Like I'm going to read two paragraphs from the book. Uh, in April 2019, Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan, who is a celebrity right now, like behind jail, you know, made his first official visit to the neighboring country, Iran. Speaking at a joint press conference in Tehran, he prefaced his talks with Iranian President Hassan Rouhani of that time by claiming in English that had the British not come into India in the 1800s, you would not need an interpreter because we all used to speak Farsi, which is Persian. The court language for 600 years in India was Farsi or Persian. Through an oversimplification, Imran Khan's statement was not far from truth. From roughly 9th to the 19th century, Persian was a prominent literary language throughout the broad region, not only consisting of Iran but reaching to the Balkans in the west to China in the east, and from Siberia in the north to India in the south. Those societies where Persian was used as a language of learning, whether or not people actually spoke Persian in their daily lives, are collectively referred to as Persianate world. India became one of the centers of Persian as various ruling dynasties in the subcontinent patronized the language, outpacing even Iran in sheer volume of Persian literary production. Many might assume the influence of Persian in the subcontinent had something to do with India being subsumed into a Persian empire, ruled from somewhere in Iran and governed by the native Persian speakers. In fact, Persian status as a Eurasian lingua franca had little to do with Iran. The language had served to link different people and societies through a Persian cosmopolis, through a shared idiom and text and common aesthetic social political form. The term cosmopolis need not suggest an idealized zone free of hierarchies, as scholars like Niall Green rightly warn us against romanticizing the Persianate past. But the Persianate was cosmopolitan in the sense that Persian learning was not the purview of one religious or ethnic community, but rather the common language of various groups. So this is actually, gives you some kind of context on what we are trying to talk about. And you know what is something very interesting, sir? In one of the universities, one of the very famous universities in India, in the School of Foreign Languages, they teach Persian. And one of my Pakistani friends said, "What are you doing?" So, it was in, and I was like, yes, he's kind of, but before I understand, I should first learn Urdu. So that was something which, was there. But the question is that do you think that because, language and traditions are often interlinked. So, do you think that the fragmentation of so called, which you're trying to critique, that nationalism was not the end of the history, but do you think that there was a certain kind of reinvention of Persianate traditions within the post colonial nation states?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I wouldn't argue that nothing changes. Simply that it doesn't totally end. But of course, the conditions are very different. The world is very different, right?
Yeah.
And so not only as you put it, is the Persianate tradition, being reinvented. I mean, in a way, it's being invented for the first time. It's being consolidated. So there's, disparate texts are being brought together in new ways in forming canons of Persian literature that may be different from which texts are most prominently studied before the rise of the nation state, for example, under different contexts. So there's a kind of invention of and consolidation of an idea of a Persianate tradition or Persianate heritage, and sure, some of that is very different under, especially you asked about the sort of the post-colonial nation state. So it's now for the first time being thought of as the heritage of a people, for example, as national heritage. This is the Iranian or Pakistani or whatever national heritage, which is not the terms under which people are going to approach these texts, of course, before nationalism, and then it's also the modern state has particular ideas about who is an ideal citizen and what should citizens be like and how should they relate to one another, and so the role of literature and the sort of literary tradition or heritage is supposed to play a pedagogical role in shaping citizens, which is not a total break with the past. That was always the role that literature or adab had played. Had a moral valence to it. It was supposed to shape you, make you. That was part of why you would study it. So that's not something that's totally different. But rather than it being a, a sort of a local teacher or perhaps a local school that is going to make decisions about what texts you should study and what are the lessons you should take from them, for example. Now you have a centralized state that can try to uniformly standardize a curriculum, for example. And so literary history comes to be something that plays that role and kind of standardizing a national narrative, for example.
Yeah. And this is something which really caught my attention when Abdul Razak Gurnah, the Zanzibar-born British author, got Nobel Literature Prize. He said something which was that whenever in English language you use words which are, say, Sanskrit, Farsi, Arabic, you italicize it.
Mm.
You means he's talking to the British or the colonizers. And this is another form of othering that you are trying to do when you italicize words in the text, creating a power asymmetry between your language and the words you have taken from the other text. How do you see that?
Yeah, Gurnah is so interesting. His use of language is also something I actually have written about, not in the book, but elsewhere. He is really drawing on has a different approach to language than what you were describing in English, even though he writes exclusively in English. So his novels are full of words that kind of evoke these Persianate connections, and
Wow.
of course they're not italicized, but they're full of words that are borrowed from these languages. Often they are Swahili words. They're words from the context that he's writing about in Zanzibar and elsewhere in East Africa. Um, but they're words that have come to Swahili through Arabic, through contact with Persian, with Urdu, with Portuguese. You know, with this kind of the language of the Persianate world, which is not exclusively Persian. So this is why other scholars, Shahab Ahmed famously being one of them, who took issue with the term Persianate and said, you know, we're not just talking about Persian here, right? Arabic plays an essential role in many places. Turkish or Turkic languages do as well, and there are of course all the so-called vernaculars of the Persianate world to think about. So he called this instead of using the term Persianate, he wanted us to think about it as the Balkans to Bengal complex, to kind of focus on
Okay.
the geography to allow for this difference of language in there. And so that, anyway, to come back to what you were saying about Gurnah, then you see that in Gurnah's novels, where there's um, this great use of the different languages that were used in this interconnected world, and it's you know, it's not random. It's things that were mediated through trade routes, and that ultimately were often connected to Persian, even if these words are not always, let's say, etymologically Persian in their origin.
Wow. I'll read your work on Gurna. And Gurna himself is very difficult to understand at times. But
Mm.
the question is asked by a student, Anurag Kont, and he's saying that, sir, could you, and you could have written a thesis instead of this question. Sir, could you throw some light on the division between Indo-Persian and Iranian Persian in the 19th and 20th century? This was also a time when Iranian literary figures like Muhammad Taqi Bahar saw the Persian spoken in India as having lost its authenticity. That's the same thing with Urdu, and many like the British would say it, due to its contact with Indian vernacular languages, compared to the pure Iranian Persian. At the same time, the resurgence of modern Persian is also attributed to the efforts of Indian Zoroastrian Parsis based in Bombay. A few of them are also in Delhi. And also the fact that modern Persian novel Bure Kuf, The Blind Owl, was written in Bombay or Mumbai. And I also pronounce for any mispronunciation.
No, no
So
worries.
I apologize.
No problem. No, a great question. So there's a number of things there. I'll try to speak to the division between so-called Indo-Persian and Iranian Persian, which is a question of diction, of pronunciation, but also comes to be a question of vocabulary, of use, and above all of style. So, um, on the level of pronunciation, there's this idea which the student who asked this question, you know, mentions, of Persian having lost its authenticity. The late Shamsur Rahman Faruqi Saab wrote about this as a kind of a loss of civilizational loss of self-confidence in India. Um, so the idea that Iranian Persian is more authentic, is more pure, more accurate in some way. And this is really a product then of nationalism, of Iranian nationalism in particular, positioning itself as the inheritor to the Persianate tradition, and the proper home and even origin of this tradition, and then it coming to be seen therefore in India as somehow derivative and inauthentic, when I would argue, if anything, a stronger argument could be made for the reverse. That, for example, the Indo-Persian, the way that Persian was pronounced in India, and that's the pronunciation that's still used in Urdu words of Persian origin, is more historically authentic, if you like. It's more conservative. So to give you an example, just really, many words that have been borrowed from Persian into Urdu. The pronunciation is different from Iranian Persian. Um, I'm trying to think of an example. Zer, under. Um, we say zir in Iran, and that the original pronunciation, and this is one kind of vowel, or the same thing in sher, lion. We say shir in Iran. That long a vowel is the original vowel. That is the original pronunciation, the much older pronunciation of these words. And some centuries ago, probably around 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. I mean, it's something that unfolded over a great deal of time. In Western dialects of Persian, so in Persian spoken in today's most of today's Iran, the distinction between certain vowels like e and e or o and u was lost. And they kind of collapsed together. So we in Iran came to pronounce all those a sounds as e, all those o sounds as u. That's something like in a word like shor, we would say shur. So it's we who changed. It's the Iranians who changed our pronunciation from what was earlier. Whereas the Persian that was still being used in India at the time didn't change. It maintained its original pronunciation. So this pronunciation, the Iranian pronunciation, because Iranian nationalism makes these sort of claims to being, as I said, the authentic sort of home of Persian, then therefore the Iranian pronunciation is taken to be the authentic pronunciation, the standard, the proper pronunciation. That's one example of this phenomenon that's being asked about. The question also asks about Bahar, who is among other things is famously criticizing a style of poetry that he associated with India. And so this is not about pronunciation. This is a question of what kind of images are appropriate to use in poetry, what kind of the use of language, what kind of words can come together, what kind of images can you create in a poem. A style of poetry that was very prevalent at the time of the Mughals and the Safavids in Iran, that valued newness, coming up with new and fresh images and metaphors and uses of language. And Bahar both gave that a sort of geographical dimension. Said, well, this is the Indian style, as he called it. This is the a sort of Indian trend in Persian poetry, and saw it as not only inauthentic, but something that was a degradation of the poetic tradition, and that poetry Persian poetry should return to the style, the use of language of the old masters of for example of Khorasan, of a geography that's more associated with Iran and Afghanistan. That's part of it. I'm sorry I'm going on at length about this. There's a because there's a lot in this question. Also asks about the connections between Iranians and Parsis.
Mm.
And so that's there's a great deal of exchange and interaction between Parsi reformers and Iranian reformers who want to sort of bring back Zoroastrianism in Iran, or recover Iran's pre-Islamic heritage and culture, and so they're invested in that project. And that's one point of circulation of course of people and ideas and text, but also of language. Then you have, Parsis who may have learned Persian in India and then go to Iran and encounter Persian that's being spoken and written in different ways, and bring back to India ideas of, okay, this is modern Persian, this is Persian as it's being spoken in Iran, and at the same time, Iranians taking from their Parsi interlocutors ideas about, here they have these greater knowledge of Middle Persian and Avestan and these pre-Islamic languages, and so these are also being drawn upon to kind of reform Persian to come up with um, purely Persian equivalents for Arabic terms. So there's a lot on both sides going on in this exchange. What I and I'll close here by saying what I tried to focus on in the book. So there's been a lot of great scholarship on those interactions between Iranians and Indian Zoroastrians or Parsis. What I tried to focus on was that Indian Muslims were also part of this story. That an earlier wave of scholarship told us, okay, there's all these connections with India in modern times in the 20th century, not just in pre-modernity. That Parsis are playing a big role in Iran's nationalist endeavors and its modernization project. And what I saw was that in addition to that, there are also Urdu speakers, Indian Muslims, who are similarly, traveling to Iran, talking with Iranians, exchanging ideas with Iranians, and playing a role in those projects as well.
Yeah, I mean, like, for example, when you say Hezbollah and when you say Hizbullah, like little differences like these. For example, Hezbollah is a more Farsi related. I can be wrong, but Hizbullah is more Arabic related.
Sure. So there's these little different differences in the qualities of those vowels as well. Sure.
Yeah, and but has it so? For example, if you are understanding a text, you can always get it from archives. But as a literary historian, how did you deal with folk tales or understanding like folklores or rhymes, like which you were maybe sung by your grandparents when you were a kid in your own nostalgic language, which has
Hmm.
no written text?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a lot that's missed, surely that I have missed in my more sort of philological approach, in my focus on texts, right? And you're pointing out, well, texts don't capture everything, right? That's a narrow kind of layer of a much broader landscape of language. We use language in all kinds of ways that are not captured in text, like folk tales and lullabies and songs that you were um, mentioning. The reason, part of I mean, there's a couple of reasons why I focused on texts rather than say orality, storytelling and folk tales and songs and so on in my work. And part of it is just my disciplinary training, that I was trained to work with texts and not trained as an anthropologist, for example, to do ethnography and capture people's oral traditions. So I work with the materials that I know how to work with best. But also because, it's not just historians or philologists who have this text-centered approach. It's my object of study, these literary elites and these new nation states that were also very concerned with text and placed a much greater emphasis and focus on texts. So even things that are oral traditions then come to be captured in text as they're rendered part of an idea of heritage or tradition. So once in the 19th and getting into the 20th centuries, once we get this idea of heritage, of tradition, of consolidating this kind of body of text that is going to be national or communal heritage of a group of people. There's this idea that in order to make it, I don't know, legible and something you can control and reproduce, it has to be reduced to writing. It has to be captured in text.
Yeah, like it's always, like a paradox. For example, I don't know if that is the cultural nuance there, but in India, for example, or even in South Asia, so every elder sibling has this uh, patronizing statement that the younger sibling was found in the dustbin. And I did it when I was a kid, and I see kids even of today using the same kind of, elder siblings using that same kind of language. And it made me wonder that this was never taught to me. I never read that I have to tease my younger sibling in that way. But I felt that, I had this power. And somehow the kids of today, somehow, when, even if it's not written, it is going through generations. And that is very fascinating.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're pointing to also the limits of that the these kind of text or even the state doesn't determine everything, right?
Yeah,
There's
yeah.
there's a kind of explicit education that you get in school that is controlled by textbooks that can be overseen by the state. But there's all kinds of other ideas like the one that you're describing
Yeah.
um, that it's a kind of education, but it's certainly not one that's subject to state control. It's not even one that's explicitly thought of as
Yes,
education. Something
exactly.
that's more organic, right?
Yes, very organic, and it keeps on happening. I'm like, how does this happen? It's very weird. But my next question, sir, is that in what ways did modern nation states, such as Iran, Afghanistan, India, uh, did attempt to redefine their literary heritage? And one is obviously because all of these countries, according to whichever regime is in power, they change the history textbooks, they change the literary books, they change the code of conduct, they change the etiquettes, depending on who the regime is. Like our history books also keeps on changing. I'm like, okay, so now we don't have Mughal history happening. Okay, but the point here is that how do you think that the observer keeps changing over the period of time?
Can you just say a little more about that? The observer keeps changing. What do
uh,
you?
Observer in the sense that, for example, when the nation states were born, say 1940s, 50s, Afghanistan under Taliban again, different context altogether. Um, my question is that how does the participant and the observer, like whoever is observing the fluidity of that language, like for example, you as a linguist, you're observing the change of language or the growth of language or the decay of language. How did state, different kinds of regimes play a role in changing what was Persianate
Mm.
over the period of time?
Well, a part of what begins as a um, still in the sort of age of empires before proper nation states under the British Raj or the Qajar Empire in Iran. Um, what begins as this sort of idea, new ideas, again, the reception of European ideas about nationalism, come to shape how people understand language, what they understand it to be. It starts. This is also, tied up not just with the reception of nationalist ideas about language, but also the reception of Darwinism, of the idea
Hmm.
of evolution. And so language comes to be understood like a living organism
Yeah.
that changes, that evolves over time, that and perhaps can mix with other languages the way that it starts to be analogized to the way you can produce a new animal or a new plant by breeding different species.
Yeah.
And so you start to get this narrative, different nationalist narratives about Persian and Urdu. Again, this begins before the era of nation states and then becomes officially promulgated by nation states as this is the narrative that's set down in textbooks that the state then commissions. Okay, we need to have a textbook that is going to tell the history of Persian, for example. Or tell the history of Urdu. And these are not just, as you know, these are not just about the history of a language, but they stand in for the history of a people, right?
Yeah.
Who are the Iranians? Their history is the history of Persian literature, is the history of the Persian language, and there's a similar approach in South Asia. What's interestingly different between these is you get totally opposite narratives about Persian and Urdu, even though their actual historical circumstances are of course, tied up with one another and are, in many ways are very similar. But you get an idea, following, as I was saying, about this idea of mixing and mixed organisms. Surely you've heard this idea that Urdu is a mix of languages, right? It's a mix of, sometimes people say Persian, Arabic, sometimes Hindi, Hindustani, Sanskrit, however they want to describe this, like Indian element to it. Sometimes people say Turkish, but the idea that it's a mix.
Yeah.
Um, on the other hand, in Iran, people are conceiving of Persian as this pure language. This goes back to that question about
Yeah.
the connection with Parsis, right?
Yeah.
The idea of Persian. Um, Persian has this unsullied, original, pure origin, and then somewhere in the middle of its lifespan, Arabic comes onto the scene, and it kind of gets mixed with Arabic, and then the modern reformers want to remove this Arabic element and return to this pure state. Again, so it's interesting that you have such a different narrative for Urdu, which is that the mixing is what makes Urdu Urdu. It wouldn't be Urdu if it wasn't mixed. One of the other names of the language, reshaped, is like literally like
Yeah.
mixed, poured together,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Um, and so again, for the Iranian national narrative, it's this history begins long before Islam, and Islam comes somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
And then the narrative that comes to be very popular for Urdu is that the beginning of Urdu has something to do with the beginning of Islam or the arrival of Muslims in the subcontinent. And so this is, part of why we get these very different narratives is the different relationship um, to colonialism and Orientalism that you kind of opened our conversation by asking about. So the
Yeah.
19th century Orientalists um, in British India, for example, are saying, well, Hindi is the inheritor of Sanskrit.
Yes.
Hindi and the Hindus are the inheritors and the continuity of Sanskrit into the present day, and so therefore Urdu cannot have that sort of long history. Urdu has to do with Islam and with people from other lands, with Persian speakers and Arabic speakers that have come from elsewhere. Whereas in Iran, they're saying, oh, Persian is the inheritor of this long tradition that goes back to Old Persian and Avestan and these sort of ancient pre-Islamic languages.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I may have strayed a bit from your.
No, no, it's very fascinating how, that language politics is also very inherent. But I want to share a very simple, like something which is not political. So in Egypt, for example, I was there for 2 months, and there was a certain day in, like, I didn't know that this was happening to me, but I was really, really yearning to speak in Hindi.
Mm,
And it was because either I could speak in Arabic or I could speak in English. And if I have to abuse someone, then it's okay. But the point is, I didn't have anyone else to talk to. There was a
mm,
certain kind of loneliness that was there because of that. And suddenly one day, I was sleeping and I heard Hindi. It was morning 6 o'clock. I ran to the reception of the hotel and I saw two elderly women speaking in Hindi. And a complete stranger, I like just gobbled them up and started speaking with them in Hindi. They were actually Pakistanis speaking in
mm.
Urdu, settled in US, who had come to Egypt for a trip. And I and that made me realize that A, the power of language and what it does to you emotionally, and B, all this boundaries, you know.
Absolutely.
It's
Yeah.
like a
This that
facade.
even today, the idea that Hindi and Urdu are totally different when on the spoken level, as in your example, they're
Yeah.
identical. I had very similar experiences when I was studying Urdu in Lucknow.
Yeah.
I was once in the bank and I was talking to my um, bank teller there about my account or something. And we were speaking in my head, what I was speaking in, I would call Urdu because I
Yeah.
was officially studying Urdu. And he surely thought of what he was speaking as Hindi. And he said, "Your Hindi is very good. How did you learn?" And I said, "I'm here in Lucknow studying Urdu. So I'm studying, in an institute here." And
Yeah.
he said, "No, no, no. I'm not talking about Urdu. I want to know about Hindi. I don't understand a word of Urdu. They speak that in Saudi Arabia or something. I don't know anything about Urdu. I want to know about Hindi." And I said, "Sir, the language that I'm speaking to you in, I will call Urdu. You could call Hindi at the spoken level. There, it was the same, just like in your experience."
Yes, exactly. And do you often visit India? Do you get a chance?
It's been a long time now. I really am yearning to go back, but it's been 10 years, I think, 9 or 10 years since I was in India, and I was there in 2013, and then again in 2014. Spent a good deal of time in India, and I thought, I mean, this is how life starts to go as you get older. I thought, okay, next year probably I'll come back for
Yeah.
research, and then I blink, and 10 years have gone by.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm really hoping to come back. Yeah.
And has it ever happened to you that, people talk to you in front of you in their own local language, whatever, it is, and they think you're an outsider and they're, maybe abusing you or using something against you, and you're like understanding it. And then you respond to them in that language. Has it ever happened to you?
Um, I think it hasn't. I totally know the kind of scenario you're describing. It hasn't happened as much to me that I've noticed. But I've definitely had friends, especially those who are more immediately, who are like blonde-haired, blue-eyed Americans who people look at them and say, "Oh, there's no way they're going to understand what I'm saying." That's definitely happened. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. I always want to do this, especially in the Arab world.
Mm.
So that is, and so Anurag is asking, sir, do you see any difference between Persian influence or the Persian spoken in Urdu and Deccani version?
Mm. Um, there are, of course, differences between the sort of Urdu of further north, North India, and Dakkani, but those are um, not necessarily about a different Persian influence on the languages, but simply about different dialects developing separately from one another. So I would tentatively say no, not to the extent that I'm aware. I haven't deeply studied Dakhani, and so maybe were I to do so, I might find things that contradict my impression that I have now. There are, of course, really interesting connections, often more direct connections between the Deccan and Iran at different time periods, where you have a lot of exchange. In part because you have, Shia dynasties that sort of facilitate the circulation of people between these two regions. Right. And today, or more recently as well, you have some waves of more recent Iranian migrants in the Deccan, the Irani community. But I have not seen that has really impacted the language seriously. Again, to the extent that I'm aware.
And on the how do you say see when what is your response when people say that translation is double defiance?
Hmm. Um, yeah, it's I'm in some ways. I mean, I have a maybe an ambivalent feeling about translation. On the one hand, I have to make a defense of it because, in a way, all of my work is translation, not just formally translating text, although I do sometimes do that, but really history. Writing about a different time is trying to translate from one context into another to make what I have learned to understand in a particular historical context in other languages. I'm writing in English about texts that I have read in Persian or Urdu, Arabic, other languages, and so I'm translating not just word for word, although that's part of it, but also translating ideas, right? Translating concepts. So I have to. I think I'm wedded to the possibility of translation because that's kind of my job description is, in a way, as translator. And at the same time, yeah, I think it's inherently limited. I do think take literary translation of poetry, and people have very strong opinions on this matter. In part, sometimes because their careers are bound up in it. They may be literary translators of poetry, and so they have to insist that yes, it's possible. It's possible to translate poetry. I think at its best, what it does is to create something new that is also poetic in the target language that draws from the source language, but is an act of poetic creation, is act of writing poetry, not just translating poetry. And certainly at its worst, I teach also Persian literature, and so in the U.S., it means a lot of the teaching I'm doing is in translation, is using English translations in the classroom because not all my students know Persian, and sometimes the translations fail to capture what is actually poetic
Yeah.
about the material. They may get the idea across, but people did not just read poetry for ideas. I mean, there's what's centrally important to it is what are the qualities that make it special? Its special use of language, which for Persian and other languages has to do with meter, has to do with rhyme. When you lose those things, as you sometimes do in for example, an English translation, you may be able to create something new that is also poetic or interesting. You may be able to get the ideas across if there is an idea. Sometimes the point of a poem is not an idea at all.
Yeah.
It's purely about the use of language, and then So some of that simply cannot be translated, I would say.
Yeah. I mean, like, for example, the Sufi folk tales or the Sufi poems or the Sufi couplets. Any translate AI that we use, it is doing blasphemy with it, you know? And at the same time, when I talk about AI and how much our lives have revolved around it, do you think all these like Gemini, Chat GPT, and various other, AI generated, they are taking away the power of old languages and infusing more power of English?
Yes. Um, I think in so much of how I am thinking, and just to sort of bridge the connection here, so much of how I'm thinking about and have been thinking about the Persianate past, I've tried to avoid a politics of nostalgia, of saying, oh, there were these great things in the past that we should try to recover, and instead to be progressive, to be future oriented, right? To be imagining what is a future that we can have that's better than the present, rather than trying to recover possibilities from the past. That being said, I become, I think, a totally almost Luddite anti-technology reactionary, even with the AI stuff. I think it's just going to be the downfall of so much that we care about. I think it brings so little good and so much destruction. And I'm really pessimistic about the possibilities of AI, ChatGPT, and all this kind of stuff. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
it has its own purpose, if you are limited with time or stuff like that. But when it comes with, again, I don't want to romanticize it, but it somehow is taking away the even the yearning for the youngsters to yearn and to want and to feel that happiness when you have started the journey of knowing a language, just like knowing another person. That
Yeah.
need is going away.
You mentioned, this affective experience that you had of yearning to speak Hindi, and looking for and finding some people who could speak it, and that connection that I'm
Yeah.
sure that you made once you could speak to them, in your own language. And I think so many, it's harder than ever right now to motivate young students to learn other languages, because the idea is, well, English can get me through life,
Yeah.
and anyone else that I need to communicate with who doesn't know English, I can use AI, I can use Google Translate or something, um, and that will take care of those problems. But you're never going to have form those kind of connections that you can through speaking another language, even imperfectly,
Yeah.
than if you're holding your phone up to someone and say, okay, Google, here's what it says in Google Translate. It's
Yeah.
nobody is going to be moved by that, I think.
Yeah, it's completely, like for example, I didn't because in Middle East and in Europe, everyone drinks tea or coffee without milk. And when I went to, I was recently traveling, and I said that I always have milk, and I should know what exactly milk is in Arabic.
Hmm.
So colloquially, it means something else. Google Translate told me it is laban.
Mhm.
So I did not use the phone in front of them, but I'm like, laban, 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 laban. And they're like, oh, milk. No, 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 no. Habibi, no. So that was, but the fact was that it comes from the idea of at least respecting the other to speak in their language.
Sure.
And that is something which is not happening. And now we will have to end, as I told Anurag. And with this, sir, thank you so much for the privilege of your time. And he's available on Twitter. You can keep writing him PhD theses and he can respond to you. You both can keep talking about all these technical details. No problem. So, and I'm really, really, we were trying to fix it for a very long time. And it was because of my health that I was not able to, I was always jammed in the head. But thank you so much for, sir. being so real and so conversational. Um,
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation. I'm glad that your health has improved, and I hope you stay healthy.